观看过去节目的视频。如果您有 T 型线圈助听器，可以使用环路听力系统。如果您对环路系统有任何疑问，或者在节目播出期间的任何时候，我们也有数量有限的听力设备。如果您听力有困难，请告知我们的工作人员或学生志愿者。节目结束后，我们将留出一些时间供观众提问。如果您有问题，请举手。一位拿着麦克风的学生工作人员会走到您面前。如果可以，请站起来。只问一个简短的问题。双元制学院的使命是围绕重要且往往棘手的话题，促进文明、尊重的讨论。在我们开始之前，请牢记这一点。我想提醒大家，请关闭手机。现在，请和我一起欢迎莱文沃斯堡指挥与参谋学院军事历史系主任戴夫·科特。谢谢艾米丽，我很感激。大家下午好，很高兴再次看到这么多人。很多熟悉的面孔。我很高兴介绍马丁·克莱门茨博士，但在此之前，我想花点时间回顾一下参谋学院军事史系与多尔研究所10多年的合作。这次合作是由军事史系的吉姆·威尔班克斯博士和多尔研究所所长吉姆·莱西先生共同发起的。为了表彰吉姆对促进和延续此次合作的贡献，以及比尔即将离任之际，我们想向你做一个简短的介绍。如果你还有时间，马丁，你能为马丁主持一下吗？所以比尔，这是一个伟大的伙伴关系，对每个人来说都是互利的伙伴关系。你在很大程度上为其中的许多方面做出了贡献。所以，代表军事历史系的教职员工，过去10年来欣赏过这些演示的所有人，请代表部门接受这份礼物，并向你们致以最诚挚的谢意。非常感谢。我们很少能成功地制造惊喜，所以这是一个很好的惊喜。马丁·克莱门茨博士今天来和我们谈谈美国在越南的领导层。当然，克莱门斯博士是一位学者，他从坦普大学加入我们，在那里他获得了博士学位。作为越南战争学者，他为我们部门做出了直接贡献，填补了威尔·班克斯博士离职后留下的空白。所以我很高兴今天能与你们分享他的才华和学识。马丁·克莱门斯博士，如果你……大家下午好，谢谢 Dave 的介绍。感谢我在 DMH 的同事们。我和一些学生从莱文沃斯一路过来。感谢多尔中心，感谢他们让这样的场地成为可能。当然，感谢各位在下午抽出时间来参加，非常欢迎大家，非常感谢。这是我第一次公开演讲，就像往常一样，这是我们人生中第一次有历史意义的演讲，需要一点学习的时间，所以请大家耐心等待。当我在房间里踱步时，如果我挡住了电视屏幕，你可以告诉我走开或者其他什么。如果你注意到在标题上，我在最初准备做演讲的时候已经加了一个名字，我本来只想看看2个人Von Nangia 和 Lewon， 但我做的是，当我开始做更多的研究时，我发现你真的不能忽略胡志明，因为他在越南战争或越南革命的胜利中发挥了重要作用，所以你真的不能把他排除在外。然后我意识到你真的也不能忽略毛泽东，因为他对他们的理论和他们独特的战争方式有着如此大的影响。但我觉得在标题和图片中塞入太多了，所以虽然我会稍微谈论一下毛泽东，但不幸的是他没有出现在标题中。 所以现在我来谈谈这些人。道格拉斯·派克，他是越南共产党研究的最重要的学者之一。他在一本书中论证了越南人民军，或者说他在一本书中声称他写了越南人民军。他是北越军队的正规军。那个天才。天才的真正衡量标准是综合能力，不是真正提出全新的理论或想法，而是真正看到联系、看到关系、可能性和即将存在的事物，并将它们综合起来，创造出全新的协同效应。这真的一些新的东西，如果你花点时间快速看一下这句话，这实际上是他本质上。他认为他们在某种程度上发起了一场前所未有的战争，而当他写这本书的时候，是1976年。他在这里所说的是，目前还没有有效的反制策略来应对这种情况。再说一遍，这是1976年，很久以前的事了，但我仍然认为，鉴于当前的形势，他可能有所发现。有很多毛泽东主义或人民革命战争的回声，不仅在越南，革命，但也超越了革命。我想在最近伊拉克和阿富汗的战争中，我会绕一圈，最后再谈这个问题。今天我要结束这个话题，我会稍微谈一下毛泽东，我会谈谈这些人，他们的世界观，他们对战争的理论概念。然后如果有时间的话，因为又犯了一个新手错误，正如一位同事指出的那样，我有太多的幻灯片和太多的东西要讲，我不得不精简，但我会试着引导你们了解一下，其中一些很重要，正如你所看到的。我在技术上也有挑战，这样更好。好的，有点好的，我们明白了。所以现在它又出来了，好的。对不起，然后我希望带你了解一些其他的主要如果你愿意的话，这就是关键点，以及这一战略如何实施，并解释了越南共产党如何在相对较短的时间内不仅击败了一个超级大国，而且击败了2个超级大国。现在关于这方面的学术研究，早期的学者们在研究越南共产党及其战争方式方面做得非常出色，这解释了他们在极其不利的情况下取得压倒性胜利的原因。他们确实做得很好，但他们主要依靠的是开源信息。如果你愿意的话，可以获取一些文件，公共法令之类的，还有河内政权和南方民族解放阵线发布的那些东西，还有对当时在场的人的采访，所以算是第一次了解历史。这真的很多，有点像开源材料，虽然还是不错的，但仍然没有什么突破性的东西。谢谢。很酷，谢谢你。正如我所说的，他仍然提供了很多见解，但没有真正的幕后故事。我们看到的很多东西都是近年来允许泄露的，但是现在有很多学者可以查阅越南档案，这确实揭开了长期以来的一个谜团。如果你愿意的话，这就像拉开面纱一样，让你了解拉起区内部到底发生了什么，越南共产党是如何参与战争的，他们最终是如何取得成就的。正如我所说的，这是一种新的前沿学术研究。我强烈建议任何真正有兴趣了解更多信息的人去看看这些学者，因为正如我所说的，基于越南档案的开放，我们真的可以了解这些人是谁。现在我不能谈论太多。这也是，如果你不了解法国殖民主义，你就无法真正理解越南革命，对吧？这才是真正引发越南革命的原因。如果你不了解法国殖民主义，你就无法理解越南革命。它太复杂了，有这么多阶段，有这么多参与者，有这么多事情发生。
and there's so many actors and so many things going on. I'm going to just have to try to briefly get through this as quickly as I can. But really, you can't understand who these individuals were, what made them tick, and what sent them down this path without understanding French colonialism. European contact in Vietnam started about the 1500s. By 1660, there were something like 200,000 Catholics in Vietnam, or Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. In the 17th century, Japan closes itself off, and this brings the attention of the Catholic world to Southeast Asia and Indochina. This is what explains why French missions were there. As they start attempting to kind of convert Vietnamese and others to Christianity, there's naturally kind of pushback from the natives that are there, from the indigenous population, and oftentimes this brings violence. This brings, in the 19th century, a pushback from the French government in the form of a military expedition. They then set up several protectorates and an outright colony in what was called Cochin China down in south of the Mekong Delta, as we call it, so that by the mid-19th century you have kind of French Indochina, which you can see up here on the map. It's essentially Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. They divide Vietnam up into three sections. But as most empires and imperial ventures were, this is largely based on racism, economic exploitation. And those things bring nothing but suffering, misery, and deprivation for the Vietnamese people. So there's naturally pushback. By the late 1890s, you start getting kind of the first stirrings of Vietnamese nationalists, right? Individuals who see what's going on, the kind of the repression of the population by the French authorities, by Vietnamese collaborators who helped the French set up their empire, and really most of the peasantry are landless, right, or own very little lands. The landlord class is exploiting them with the help of the French. This naturally kind of generates pushback from early nationalists. Now, these individuals, right, these are the kind of focus of today's talk. Again, a lot of detail on these individuals, which I really can't go into, but I think the kind of common denominators about all of them is that they're anti-colonialists. This is the main thing that makes them tick. They're also nationalists, right? They're really, for them, the whole objective is to first get the French out, right, and then to achieve Vietnamese independence. Later on, as we know, the Americans get involved. And they're also, again, trying to make sure that the United States does not get involved anymore. But for them, it's always the idea of achieving Vietnamese independence as well. So first they have to get the French out, then they have to defeat the South Vietnamese regime and preclude the Americans, which we come in. But nonetheless, that's the thing that's driving them. They're also committed communists, right? They are Marxist-Leninists. They believe in the ideology. They are true believers, some more so than not, right? So by the early 20th century, by 1920, the Indochina Communist Party is formed. And then later on, the Indochina Communist Party evolves into the Viet Minh is created in 1940, which was a front organization led by the communists as well, too. Okay, but for these individuals, right, really what makes them tick is the idea of Vietnamese independence, the end of French colonialism, right, but then, of course, Marxist-Leninism, which is not only independence for Vietnam, but they also had a vision for exporting revolution throughout the world as well, too. This was also the other idea. It's not just about Vietnam. It was making those larger, broader connections to the larger communist world, including the Soviet Union and China, for exporting revolution as well, and this was kind of the driving forces behind these individuals. Now, as far as their characteristics go and who they were as people, they were dedicated, they were committed, right? They were resolute about what they were doing. They were also determined and indefatigable. They were not going to be swayed from their end. And they continued from start to finish, despite many hardships, despite the long odds, and they were committed that they were going to liberate Vietnam, right, and establish a socialist country, reunite the country under communist control as well. So they're very committed to that. They were also very ruthless as well, too, They had no compunctions about eliminating rivals, both violently and otherwise. As you'll see, one of the things I'm going to talk about is that there was a division in the Politburo. They were not all unified. And when it came down to getting rid of political rivals, be they non-communist or even communist, they had no compunction about doing that as well. Also, repressing their own populations as well, too, not only in South Vietnam and areas that they were trying to gain control, but also once they established North Vietnam, they had no problems in kind of repressing the population. They tried several attempts at kind of liberalizing, but once they saw that there was honest and open critique about the regime, they had no problems kind of clamping down on that as well, too. So they're pretty ruthless as well. Also very cunning is another thing. One thing that they were masterful at was creating a narrative about what they were trying to do. They were really good at painting who wore what hat, the white hat or the black hat, right? Who is in what camp? And really casting what they were doing as a just war. Revolutionary War was always just, and those who opposed it were unjust. And they were very good at sending that message as well, too. One of the things I'll talk about later on as well, too, is this messaging was really key. Their diplomatic efforts were really keyed around, transmitting that message around the world. And that's one of the things that was really instrumental in helping them achieve their goals, right? So that's another thing, right? They were very good at selling their message around the world, right? Getting allies, both communists and not, to really see how they wanted the war to be portrayed, that what the United States, right, what the French and the United States were doing was unjust, and what they were doing was very just. They were also good at propagandizing the people, right? When you're talking about building mass politics and really sending a message and creating a very select narrative for people to join your movement, they were good at that as well, too. They were very good at also hiding some things that might be inconvenience for them. For instance, once you had North and South Vietnam, they refused to allow wounded or convalescing soldiers back up to North Vietnam, simply because they did not want people seeing what was going on. They had a very controlled image of what was going on down there. Excuse me. Also, Vietnamese soldiers who went down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, who did so, right, by the hundreds of thousands, right, they were told that they were not fighting fellow Vietnamese. They covered the Civil War aspect of this. They essentially told they were there to fight the French, fight the Americans, and those puppets that were collaborating with us too, who were exploiting our country. So they're very good at controlling their message as well too. Something else which really explains what they were able to achieve and how they were able to achieve it. All right, as I talked about, there was a schism within the Politburo, right? There was a conflict between these two. And they were divided over a number of different things, including their political objectives, right? And also military strategy. They had a lot of divisions, right? And as you could see, they pretty much were broken up into these two camps. You had the moderates on one side, right? And these were, they became the leadership really early on, right? Of the Viet Minh and then later the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. That's Ho Chi Minh and Vo Ninh Giap. And really people, when they talk about leadership of the Vietnamese communists. Everybody knows these individuals, right? And they're really critical in the first phase, right? The Franco-Vietnam War, the first Indochina War against the French. But they were considered by many to be too moderate, right? And here you have the second camp. But this is the hardliners led by Le Duan, who was one of the major, players in the game. And by 1964, he's really in the driver's seat, not so much Ho Chi Minh and Ngo Dinh Diep. When I talked before about the elimination of rivals and the ability to have no qualms about kind of doing that, either violently or otherwise, they did not put Ho Chi Minh or Ngo Dinh Diep to death, right? However, they had no problem kind of overshadowing them in the Politburo, right? So you really have this division. On one hand, you have the moderates led by Ho Chi Minh and Diep, and on the other side, you have the hardliners, including Le Duan, Le Duc Tho, Pham Hung, and Nguyen Chi Thanh. Nguyen Chi Thanh is the only five-star general in the North Vietnamese army, with the exception of Diep, right? And for them, there is no compromise, right? When Ho agrees to sign the Geneva Accords, that they don't like that, right? They believe that they should continue to fight. When it comes to strategy, right? Again, this goes back to Mao, whether you're going to have a protracted war strategy or a more direct strategy to kind of conquer the South Vietnamese regime. The hardliners want to go for broke, as you'll see, one of the things I'll talk about, where Ho Chi Minh and Diep, what they really want to do is they want to have a more protracted kind of guerrilla kind of conflict. But I'll go into a little bit more detail. But nonetheless, on the face, right, it appeared that the Politburo was always in unison, right? They were always in step. They were in agreement. Most people knew these two on the left, but really there was not. There was a lot of division, but however, the Hawks really take control by 1964, and this is one of the things that gets the ball rolling to bring the Americans in and then generate the second Indochina War as well, too. Now, allies, too, you got to briefly talk about some of these individuals. Of course, Mao's People's War, revolutionary warfare, was an inspiration, right? And for the Vietnamese communists, they looked through the prism of Maoist warfare when creating their own theories and their own doctrines. Stalin, right, is a critical player, right? Initially, Stalin is very reluctant to recognize the Democratic Republic of Vietnam after 1945. However, after 1949, once Mao comes to victory, right, the Chinese Communist Party comes to victory in 1949, now all of a sudden Stalin is willing to start working with the Vietnamese, because you have the Sino-Soviet split, which also plays a critical role in what the Vietnamese communists thought and how they actually acted as well. As we know, though, Stalin dies in 1953. And he's replaced by Nikita Khrushchev, or succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. And Nikita Khrushchev wants to have peaceful coexistence with the West, and this creates all kinds of problems. The Soviet heresy, it's called, people like Mao and Le Duan and the hardliners in Vietnam feel betrayed by the fact that now Khrushchev is willing to make ovations and actually we seek some kind of agreement with the United States, some kind of peaceful coexistence, right? And that's something else that will play out in the Politburo, is the fact that people now look at what Khrushchev's doing as some kind of heresy, including Mao. Mao wants to be now in China to be the vanguard of worldwide revolution, and they start using that, and that creates tensions between the Soviet Union and China, People's Republic of China, right? And then, but that kind of tension between the two will play out. Khrushchev, however, is succeeded by Brezhnev in 1964, and Brezhnev once again starts trying to not be outdone by Mao in his revolutionary zeal. So what happens is now you have this kind of ebb and flow between the Chinese and the Soviets as far as supplying aid to Hanoi. And Hanoi plays them both masterfully. They get what they need at the right times. Now, it's not all love all the time. There's a lot of pressure on the Politburo at particular times during these conflicts to back off, sign a peace treaty, don't go through with this, right? But nonetheless, Hanoi is able to kind of resist some of that pushback or those kind of pressure from Beijing and Moscow and continue to do what they want to do regardless, right? So the Sino-Soviet split really has an impact on what they do. But see, these are their allies. Their adversaries, right? I can't go into this too much, right? I put up here really three of the most well-known French generals. I wasn't going to put any of the politicians there because between 1945 and 1954, there were 13 different French governments, right? And there's no way I was going to try to get to know who they were, all those individuals, and put their pictures up here, right? So this is really why I just essentially just stuck with the French generals. Other adversaries as well, too. Once the French are gone, you have the existence of, quote-unquote, two Vietnams, right? And then really South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, is really its official name. You have a first and second republic, right? Again, I can't go into much detail on these two regimes. All I can say is regardless whether it was the First Republic or the Second Republic, all of these individuals were staunch anti-communists, and they were hell-bent on resisting, right, Hanoi's aims to conquer the South, topple the South Vietnamese regime, and reunite the country under communist control. Here you can see the Republic of Vietnam. This is the main military force that the communist forces went up against, and as you could see, over time, it grows exponentially, right? Despite the fact, even after the United States gets involved, right? So that by the time the Americans are leaving or pretty much gone by 1971, 72, there's over 1 million individuals under arms in South Vietnam. That includes both regular forces, right, and irregular forces, something they called regional forces and popular forces, who were kind of territorial. They were province-based, they were district-based, they were part-time regular doing kind of paramilitary, nation-building type stuff. But nonetheless, this is the kind of hybrid forces they have, and by 1971, 72, there are over 1 million of them. So these were the kind of military adversaries that Hanoi and its military forces were up against. The United States, again, 4 presidential administrations, right? 4 administrations, right, go against Hanoi's aims. You can say really 5 if you include the Truman administration, right, who by 1954 is funding 80% of the French war effort, right, despite being at first very reluctant to help the French due to the exigencies of the Cold War, right? They do by 1950, they start getting involved. A couple other things happen to facilitate America to finally help the French, right? But by 1954, they are footing 80% of the French war bill, right? So really 5 administrations as well, too. As far as military adversaries, right, as you could see, once again, why Vietnam is so complex, right? The conflicts in Vietnam, particularly in even the Second Indochina War, right, is that there are 3 different phases. We had an advisory phase, we had an actual combat phase, and then we had a combat withdrawal phase, right? As you can see under the 4 key kind of administrations that are going on here. These are the 3 key military generals that were there during various points, right? It was Paul Harkness and William Westmoreland during the advisory and combat phases, and then Crichton Abrams takes control after 1968 during the combat withdrawal phase as well, too. He's largely in charge of the Vietnamization program as well, too. Okay, as promised, we're going to talk a little bit about Mao, right? Mao and his theory of protracted revolutionary warfare, right? Mao never had a comprehensive theory that he wrote down. He went to sit down. He pieced it together by his writings, right? And he was very prolific in his writing, as you can see, particularly during the 1930s, right? First fighting with the Kuomintang, right? The Chinese nationalists, but then, of course, the Japanese as well, too, after they invade during World War II. And based upon his practical theories, right, he developed this kind of theory, right? So it's based partly on his experience, but also military theorists as well, too. If you read Mao, and I know Professor Babb has read a lot of Mao as he's teaching the Chinese way of war at Leavenworth, there are elements of both Clausewitz and Jomini as well in Mao's reading. So you can kind of pick up on some of that. He was well-versed in military theorists as well, too, including Western military theorists. You can see those kinds of things as well. Now, yes, the same thing, right? As a member of the Chinese Communist Party, right? The idea is that this is Marxist-Leninist revolution in an agrarian context, meaning essentially China is a large, I think Mao used this term, as semi-feudal society, right? In which there are very few cities, very little industry. So where is the proletariat going to reside? And Mao is really the first who recognizes the proletariat is the peasantry, right? Because this is what China, this is our social composition, largely peasants. This is where your revolutionary people and your movement and your army is going to be built, right? So he still takes the idea of Marxism-Leninism, meaning you have a vanguard party. You're not just going to wait around, as Marx was saying, for something simply to happen, right? You got to make it happen. You got to create this vanguard party who, through violence, is going to seize power, right? Set up the dictatorship of the proletariat and create this kind of socialist paradise on earth. So he did so, but he contextualizes this movement, right? Communist revolution within an agrarian context. The primacy of politics, right? This is another thing that Mao is known for, right? The idea that really politics is what drives this whole thing. Every military action is geared towards achieving some political goal as well. He doesn't lose sight of that. Also, just war, right? He is also another one who's characterizing that imperialism and imperialistic wars are bad, right? Revolutionary wars against imperialism are just wars to do so. So he starts framing that as well, too. Mass politics, this is another thing, right? In order to raise an army, this is where Mao is going to create his movement, to create his army to eventually defeat the nationalists and unite China under, again, right, a communist regime. You're going to find it among the people. So he goes out, sets up Soviets or base camps in the area. This is how slowly grow your movement in the countryside, right? By seizing arms, you do guerrilla warfare, you give the peasantry what they want, and you slowly grow your movement over time. Also the army. This is something when I teach my students at Leavenworth, it's hard for them as apolitical soldiers. Right? The idea that they're not thoroughly politicized in one party or ideology or another. To try to tell them how in China and for the Vietnamese as well, that their armies were thoroughly politicized, right? They were constantly propagandized, and they had the kind of education programs or re-education, whatever you want to call it, kind of agitprop sessions. I forget what they used to call these reflection sessions or whatever, where they were constantly steeped in Marxist-Leninist ideology constantly. So the army was not really there to serve the nation. It was really there to serve the party first and foremost. So they thoroughly politicized their military as well. So As far as mass politics, again, not just the peasantry to grow a movement, right, to grow your political movement, because that is where the people were. They resided in China, but also the army as well, too. Asymmetry, right? Mao's theory of people war is based upon the idea of an asymmetrical, right? You are fighting a larger, more powerful enemy. You have to, that's the nature of it, you have to rely then, therefore, on guerrilla warfare and protracted war as well, too, right? To stretch the conflict over time, right? Because so really, guerrilla warfare is a product of the asymmetrical situation that Mao encounters in China as well. Hybrid as well, too, right? Mao's People's War, is a hybrid thing. It's not just guerrilla warfare, right? It's guerrilla warfare in tandem with regular or conventional forces as well, too. Evolutionary, right? The stages. This is one of the things that Mao is known for, right? He creates, he makes his conceptualization that there are 3 stages, right? That your movement is going to start initially at the strategic defense. You're very small, your party's small, you don't have very many soldiers or supplies and equipment, so really got to be on the defense, right? However, you're out in the countryside, you're among the people, you're using agitprop to kind of get them on your side, to demonize the opposition. You're trying to gain whatever arms you can and start using kind of small-scale political violence, right? To create safe havens, a place where you can rest and kind of hang out for a while and grow your movement over time. As you start growing, your movement grows, your military forces start growing, then you're ready to start switching over to the strategic equilibrium, right? Meaning you now are using guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines in tandem with your base areas to start now attacking, right, the incumbent regime, right? Meanwhile, you're still trying, you're building combat power, you're building your political movement as well, too, and by the time you reach, after you reach full equilibrium, then you want to continue and move on to what he called the strategic offense, where this is now going to be a war of mobility by regular forces, conventional force on conventional force. Now, it didn't play out, and Mao himself never said, this is set in stone, these sequences, one after the other, this is the only way it's going to go. He recognized that there was going to be oftentimes contingent on local situations, that this was going to happen. But nonetheless, there was this idea that this is going to progress. This is almost like a natural progression to kind of grow from a small band of individuals to a guerrilla movement up through the construction of a regular army who, through a coup de main, is going to then eventually seize power. Right? And of course, the importance of base areas and dominating the spaces, as he called it, right? And I'll talk a little bit about this as well, because this also plays out in Vietnam as well. Now, I believe it's J.L. Katzenbach. He wrote a famous book about the Korean War. He was a Harvard professor, and in 1954, he wrote an article that was called Space, Time, and Will, right? And what he identified in this article was essentially that there are tangibles in war. There are things that you, like kind of the bean counting stuff that you can identify, right? You have manpower, you have weapon systems, you have logistics, things that are kind of tangible, real world, right? But there are also intangibles as well, too. And he said that Mao was seized upon those intangibles. He knew them, and what his success for, what the intangibles he used for success was space, time, and will. Space involved growing your movement through base areas, right? Mao famously said that base areas are like a buttocks, right? That gives the guerrilla movement a place to sit down and rest every once in a while. So base areas were really key for the movement against Japan, but then also against the Chinese nationalists as well, too. This is the thing that allowed Mao to build combat power again, to build his mass movement in the countryside by gathering the population, the peasantry on his side, right? So you set up a system of base areas, usually in remote areas, which is difficult for the kind of your enemy to get to you at, right? And also in tandem with base areas, use guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, right? And what this does is essentially kind of typical guerrilla tactics. You hit, you run, you fight only, you only attack targets of opportunity, you live to fight another day, right? So by combining these two, the base areas and guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, this is going to protract the conflict, right? As the government or whoever's your enemy simply cannot come to grips, right, with you. But because of guerrilla warfare, because you're not waiting around for an easy target, as I said, you're kind of hitting and moving, running away, right? The movement is going to stretch out over time, right? You're going to protract the war. And what that does, if you can stretch it out long enough, you're going to increase morale on your side as your movement grows, but you're also going to demoralize the enemy as well, too, simply because they cannot annihilate you. They can't find you and destroy the kind of guerrillas, right? They're just based upon the kind of evasive nature of guerrilla warfare. So by setting up base areas, conducting guerrilla warfare, that's going to protract the conflict. That's where the term protracted warfare comes from. And this is what's going to eventually give, support, build willpower on your side, but then also undermine your enemy's will as well, too. Right? So space, time, and will, this was the formula for Mao's successes, right? And the kind of weird spatial configuration that you can see, Mao called this a war of jigsaw pattern, right? This is not a war of traditional front lines, right, where the enemy's on one side, you're on the other side, friendly forces on the other. Instead, they're actually intermingled. They're kind of mishmashed all together. And this is where he brings in Jominian principles of interior-exterior lines, envelopment and counter-envelopment, right? And that's maybe von Moltke as well, too, these kind of principles, right? But nonetheless, right, you have enemy and friendly forces intermingled as opposed to kind of being separated, as really is not always 100%, but in the case of kind of conventional warfare as well, too, right? So this is what he calls a war of jigsaw pattern. And the idea is same thing again. It's providing multiple kind of, by stretching your enemy's forces out over time. That's what this combination of base areas and guerrilla warfare will do. It's going to stretch out your enemy's forces, and then you can knock them out with the kind of coup de main. And this is something that largely played out in China over time. So Katzenbach, again, he saw these as Mao's intangibles, right? Space, time, and will is what explains why the CCP was able to achieve victory against the Kuomintang in 1949. Now, the Vietnamese communists, they saw their struggle through the lens, right, of Mao's three-stage, right, protracted warfare, right? So there's a lot of similarities in how they looked at certain things. And if you look in their writings, particularly Trong Chin's, right, the resistance will win in 1947, his is almost it's almost an exact blueprint, right, of Mao's three-stage process, right? But again, same thing. It's a Marxist revolution, right? However, it's in a rural, largely agrarian society as well. Same thing, also an ad hoc kind of theory, right? Based upon history, looking at Mao, but then other instances as well of revolutions and kind of guerrilla struggles in the early 20th century as well. Their own experience, right? Fighting first against the Japanese, later on the French, they start developing these things over time. Also military theorists as well, right? If you read Giap and others, you can see not only Western military theorists, right, but then also Mao as well, and then their own history, right? If you go back into the kind of the mists of time in Vietnamese, there are several kind of generals who can use guerrilla warfare against larger enemies, including China as well too, and the Mongols, right? So they use these things as well too. They looked at history, they looked at other theorists, they borrowed some of their ideas to create their own ideas about revolutionary warfare as well too. Again, primacy of politics, everything was geared towards that political end. All actions were geared towards that and put within that context. Same thing, a just war concept. As I said, they were very good at branding themselves and telling the world, and a lot of people, right, fell for it, right? A lot of propaganda, but nonetheless, people fell for it. It was effective in painting their cause as a just cause, and that their enemies, as unjust as well too. Mass politics, same thing. Peasantry in the army, they adopt the same thing. They not only thoroughly, use politics to get people on their side, right, but then also to build a thoroughly politicized army as well. Asymmetrical, right, against larger, more powerful enemies. They also rely on guerrilla warfare and protracted warfare as well too. Also, hybrid forces using guerrillas, right, kind of territorial or militia and main forces or regular fighters as well too, all together in a nice melange, if you will. Also evolutionary, right, the idea that it's going to gradually, your movement's going to grow over time. They also believed in these kind of three stages as well. That plays out more, though, however, in the First Indochina War, not so much the second. There's an important variation. This is where Les Zwan comes in, which I'll talk about a little bit. But still, they use these three stages. They use them. They talk about them. They wrote about them as well too. And then, of course, they also use this idea of base areas and eliminating the spaces as well, or dominating the spaces. Okay? Some of the differences. The United Front, right? Yes, Mao had a front, right, and there were times where actually the nationalists and the Chinese Communist Party united and fought the Japanese, right? But the United Front here in Vietnam was a little bit different, because what it was is essentially the attempt to marry the peasants and the kind of workers, right? He was talking about that. And also whatever kind of petty bourgeois or landlords that were willing to follow, right, or to buy into the revolution, right, particularly against the French when it was an anti-colonial war, to create a front of different aspects of society and to present it as a nationalistic movement first and foremost. This is something they did. Ho and the others were very good at hiding the kind of communist elements to it. It's one of the things that helps create kind of sympathy among individuals around the world, and there's always been debate over the years about whether Ho Chi Minh and others were really committed communists or nationalists, right? They were really both, right, as well. But this United Front, be it the National Front, the National Liberation Front and the Second Indochina War, or the Vietnam Independence League, or Viet Minh, during the First Indochina War. Remember, these are fronts, right? They're put forward simply as nationalistic organizations that are either anti-imperialist, right, or anti-American or kind of neo-imperialist when it comes to the Second Indochina War as well, too. Something called parallel hierarchies, right? This is something that the communists were brilliant at, and that was essentially mirroring, right, the government, whether it was the collaborationist government with the French, right, or when it came to the Second Indochina War, once you had South Vietnam, mirroring their government at every level, right, from the top all the way down to individual villages and hamlets. They would have a shadow government in areas they did not control, but they also had their own administrative government or governance in places that they did control, right? but this is something they were able to do. They were embedded within the very fabric of Vietnamese society, right? And as I said, that was from the government and top level all the way down to the individual village, right? They were able to do that, to get themselves in and amongst the people and amongst the government, and they were able to use that to garner information, to do agitprop, to try to stir up unrest against the South Vietnamese government or what the Americans were doing over there. But they were very good at creating a system which mirrored, right, the existing government as well. Something else as well, too. Yes, they believed in Mao's stages, right, but they believed they transitioned back and forth between them. And this led one scholar to classify Vietnam as a mosaic war, meaning that in one area you could have low-level agitation, right, the kind of first stage, right, the strategic defense that Mao talked about. Meanwhile, in the province over, one province over, you can have full-blown conventional main force warfare, meaning very, highly conventional warfare. And in the province next to that, you can have a mid-level kind of guerrilla conflict. So it really depended on the place. And oftentimes, if you looked at any given time in Vietnam, and there were 44 provinces in South Vietnam, the situation was very different in one place or another. Sometimes you would even have a village, which is a conglomeration of hamlets, right, in which you would have a single village in which some hamlets in there were communist-controlled and others were controlled by the government, and there are various different forms of fighting that were going on there as well, too. This is another key aspect of there, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, too, is an aggressive attack on the national will of their enemies. For them, this was always, as Clausewitz says, the center of gravity, right, for them. This is where they were on to something. The idea that, you know what, we might be able to win this, right, and largely they did, right, by not through kind of strict military force, but by targeting the will of their enemies. And that includes the French population and then, of course, the United States, including the anti-war movement and doves in Congress as well, too, by the time the 1970s roll around. And this is where Les Zwan really comes in. This is the idea of a general offensive and general uprising, which I'll talk a little bit more about in detail in a few minutes as well, too. Right, so as you can see, this is really the combination, right? On one hand, yes, they're still using protracted warfare. They're using time, space, and will, as Mao talked about, right, to stretch out your enemy, to exhaust their will, and then, right, give them the jab with the kind of coup de main. But at the same time, they would still take chances of trying to go for broke, quote unquote, right, to try to generate and get this thing going quickly, if possible, in response to various different things. And for the Politburo, at first it was making sure that the United States does not get involved, even when it was just the French, right? When it looked like they were going to reach some kind of negotiated settlement in and around the period of Dien Bien Phu, Ho Chi Minh was always concerned that the United States were somehow going to get involved, and we had to really preclude that. We couldn't have that. So they had this kind of dual approach. They had the protracted war of Mao on one hand, but they also had this, hey, if we can do it, let's get some kind of quick decision as well, too, kind of rapid military victories as well, too, to bring about victory in a much quicker time, if possible. Now, this is a hard concept to understand, right? Dao Tran is something that Douglas Pike has written about pretty extensively, right? And really, it means struggle, but it doesn't, right? And it's hard and complex, and I still am kind of like, okay, right? The kind of philosophical underpinnings, right? And how it doesn't really equate to what we think as struggle, really. But really, if you're going to break it down, what Dow Tran was, this was the kind of animating principle behind the Vietnamese Revolution, right? What people like Ho, Giap, and Le Duan were all about. And as you can see, it really was an integration, right, of political and military effort, right? It was a kind of synthesis, right, of those two things, right? On one hand, you had armed struggle, and that was everything from military combat, right, to kind of assassinations or kidnappings at the local level. They called this the violence program, right? You see, always cast within a political context. So everything they did, and this is something the Vietnamese were always good at, no matter what action they took, whether it was regular military, whether it was guerrilla warfare, or kind of, these kind of targeted assassinations or kidnappings at the local level by the political cadre and infrastructure, it was always within this context of the larger political thing, what they were trying to achieve, getting some kind of political benefit out of this, right? They never evaluated what they were doing in simple military terms, right? Even diplomacy, right? As you see, that everything was kind of mixed up, which I'll talk about actually in a little bit, right? So on one hand, you have armed struggle. On the other side, you have political struggle. Right, and you can see it's non-military activity, right? And it's really almost everything. If you classify it, it's either les ductos at the Paris peace talks down to a local cadre trying to using agitprop on the local population. Everything that was kind of political action, right, they think was part of this Dow Tran struggle. A key element of it was 3 action programs that they talked about. The first one was action among the enemy. This was classic agitprop that tried to get the South Vietnamese population, who was not opposed to the Saigon regime, opposing the Saigon regime, right? Essentially casting out they are oppressors, right? They are imperialists, they're doing bad things, to try to agitate the people to try to rise up and try to oppose the South Vietnamese government, to change their perception. Also in the United States as well, too. This is something else. This is part of their struggle, like I said, targeting the populations of their enemies. This was part of this political struggle as well, too, and this van or action program among the enemy. The second one was action among the people, right? This is organizing and propagandizing the population, right? Including those that are under, when you're talking here, those that are under communist control. And there were large swaths of areas that were under communist control at any given time throughout the conflict, right? It dealt a lot with village administration. One thing about the communists that they were good at, when they controlled an area, it wasn't just to control it, right? What they were trying to do is try to reify the tenets of Marxism and Leninism. They would do land reform, right? They would do land redistribution, right? They would propagandize the people. They would use all these things. They were trying to create their own little kind of Soviets and their own little socialist societies in areas under their control, right? So that's where this other van program comes in, action among the people. And then the last one was action among the enemy's troops, right? Obviously trying to entice the Republic of Vietnam armed forces, right, to either defect or just simply lay low, right? And there were accusations of that later in the war after the Tet Offensive. When there was a low level of action, and it was argued that oftentimes that there was some kind of unwritten agreement between the South Vietnamese forces, particularly the territorial forces, meaning those that were at the kind of district and province level, and kind of local guerrillas to really, you don't bother us, we won't bother you as well too, right? But this was another key element, right? The idea that you were going to proselytize among your enemy's troops to try to get them to defect or to simply stop opposing you. And they use these in action, or excuse me, use these in tandem. Now this is a kind of a chart that Pike puts out in his book, and you can see, and he characterizes it as kind of 2 pincers, right, that were supposed to be used at once. Armed Dow Tran and political Dow Tran at once, which are geared towards the enemy. And again, you can see it's broken into armed and political doctrine. You have a regular force strategy, meaning high technology, meaning conventional warfare on one hand, a limited offensive warfare again as well too. We're talking really, lower levels, right? Because as I said, this was a tiered system of combat and conflict. You can do, then you have on the other side protracted conflict, meaning Maoist guerrilla warfare, and something he called neo-revolutionary guerrilla warfare, which I won't go into, but that's something else. That's something that took place after the Tet Offensive in 1968, when there was a lot of low level of activity, kind of economy of force actions, if you will, right, by the communists simply because they had gotten beat up pretty bad during the 1968 Tet Offensive. And of course, you can see the three political action programs, if you will, as well, too. So you can see here, and I think this is really the best quote, that really all actions taken in war, really military or political, right? No matter what it is, from high to low, high intensity, low intensity, simple things, complex things, doesn't matter. It's all geared to these two kind of Dow-Tran strategies, right? Which is, as I said, a synthesis aimed towards the enemy as well, too. So this is the kind of animating principle. Now, they didn't call this the rule of three. I called it the rule of three simply because it's kind of strange. It's kind of funny that you see all these kind of three things, right? And it's something that academics like to do too. Isn't that like a writer's thing? Like having a three of something in writing is like makes it the strongest, right? But nonetheless, they were big on three things. Not only three stages of warfare, right? But three other things as well too. Three types of war. Special war was essentially what they called it when they were fighting the South Vietnamese regime, helped by the United States or assisted by the United States. Limited war, they called it, once the United States gets involved, this is limited. And general war, which is something they never did, but that's something that they had they conceptualized, as if it does break out and somehow China or the Soviet Union gets directly involved, you're going to have a general war. So they have three types of war. Another thing they were good at doing as well, too, is breaking up South Vietnam into three geostrategic regions, which aligned closely with those forces and with the three types of forces as well. In the mountain and forest regions, meaning in the areas that are remote, far away, right? This is where you would have your conventional forces fighting the American conventional forces as well, too. In the lowland areas where the people were populated, this is where you have your local and regional forces, meaning local guerrillas, right, and local militia as well, too, right? And then in the cities, this is where you're going to have popular forces or this kind of shadow government I was talking about, infrastructure, doing these things, right? So these three types of forces loosely correlated to these three geostrategic regions. And the kind of effort they put in of Dow-Tran, whether political or military or what mixture of that they did, right, that was usually geared towards these three areas. Naturally, the South Vietnamese government was strongest in the cities, right, as it was in China, right, with Mao. And then in the countryside, this is really where the communists were stronger as well, too. Three types of struggle. This is important, too. Again, this is a synthesis, and this is the thing. They see these things acting together. Military struggle on one hand, which we talked about, political struggle, but then, of course, diplomatic struggle as well, too. And this is something that's really important for them. You can see there's three diplomatic circles that they use. The first one, and this is one way they were able to garner sympathy for their movement and to really undermine support for the United States, not only here, right, in the United States itself, but on the international stage as well, too, right? So first thing that they're targeting is other communist parties, to get fellow socialist societies to sympathize with them, which they naturally would, and that was part of their diplomatic effort, to gain kind of support, right, from fellow communist countries, which is something they did. Another thing they did was, or another circle or target of their diplomatic efforts was non-communist nationalistic regimes, right? Be it communist or not, the 1960s was a period of a lot of anti-colonial movements throughout the developing world, and they were trying to make those contacts and connections with them. Hey, you might not be communist, but you know what? We're both struggling against imperialism, so help us out. That was another aspect of this, their diplomatic struggle as well, too. And then the third one, of course, was Western non-state actors, particularly the French public during the Franco-Vietnam War, or First Indochina War, and then, of course, the American public during the Second Indochina War as well, too. And this is something they did. And what they were good at, too, like I said, when they were cunning and they did these things, their message was simply this: we are not your enemies. Your government and its unjust war and the crimes it's committed against the Vietnamese people, they are your enemies. And that sold very well, not only internationally, but here in the United States as well, too. Not only among the kind of anti-war movement on the street, but also in the halls of Congress as well, too, right? And that's how they portrayed it, and that's how they're able to do this, right? Not that America's evil, right? But America's good, right? And we like the American people. However, you have a bunch of criminals in charge, right, who are trying to impose a neo-imperialist regime on us through a puppet state here in South Vietnam, right? And of course, always highlighting napalm and things like the My Lai massacre, right, which of course was just an opportunity for them to really exploit the kind of bad things that were going on by Americans, GIs over there, right? So this is really the three diplomatic circles, and this is really the thing that works, right, for them. Because ultimately, in the end, it is the United States and France whose will breaks, right? French are willing to sign the Geneva Accords in 1954 because they're done. The French population is tired of this war. It's been dragging on. It's costing blood. It's costing treasure, right? It has this kind of icky feel to it, too. There's always that racial component and imperialistic kind of aspects to it, right? They want out by 1954. Dien Bien Phu is the kind of straw that broke the camel's back. It doesn't change the balance of power in Vietnam at all, right? The French are still pretty powerful in a lot of places. The Viet Minh are strong in their areas as well, too, right? But Dien Bien Phu is this kind of cause célèbre, if you will, that really breaks the French will. They say, all right, we're out of here. Once the United States gets involved, they're looking for that same kind of targeting going on, and they do. It's really the United States, particularly after the Tet Offensive, which its will is broken, and we're getting out of here, right? So this is the way they looked at things, right? And this is I think, the important aspect of it. These three different struggles which they synthesize so well, so powerfully, and these diplomatic circles in which by doing this, ultimately they do exhaust the United States' political will, and we do end up leaving. Right, just to give you what I was talking about before a little bit, they also borrowed some of the aspects from Mao's intangibles, right? The idea of using base areas, right, and guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines, right? As you can see, these areas over here, these kinds of strange polygons, those are their base areas, right? Inside of South Vietnam as well as outside of South Vietnam. And these things existed almost throughout the entire conflict. Despite concerted efforts by the South Vietnamese armed forces and the United States, they simply could not eliminate these things. Naturally, they had safe havens in Laos and Cambodia, right, up until 1970, right, when Nixon goes into Cambodia, 71 into Laos. These things were traditionally off limits, and this is something that allowed, right, the communists to wage their brand of warfare, be it conventional or even the irregular guerrilla warfare. They'd be able to go into South Vietnam, right, attack at a time and place of their choosing, right, and then they'd hightail it out of there either into their base areas, which are very hard to root out, right, even inside Vietnam, but then into Laos and Cambodia, and then never forget what they called the Great Rear Base Area, which was North Vietnam as well, too. The United States and South Vietnam, there was never any intention of invading North Vietnam. They knew that. They knew that, right, that was a safe haven for us, and that's what allowed them to rest and refit and rebuild and build their combat power and stuff over time, outlast the Americans and South Vietnamese efforts to destroy them, right, and ultimately drag the conflict out, right? And here you can see, as it goes before, again, a war without fronts, right, the kind of intermingling, if you will, right, of communist and non-communist forces as well, too, and having particular zones of control. All right, here's another picture of what this kind of war without fronts situation looks like. This is something known as the Hamlet evaluation system that was developed, and that was an effort to figure out what's the level of political development and military, but what's the political and military situation throughout South Vietnam. What they would do, they would have advisors go out, they'd have a series of questions to ask individuals based upon how many schools or medical dispensaries have been built, have there been any local kind of National Liberation Front or guerrilla activities in the area, and based upon those questions, they would feed them into a computer, right, and it would assign each individual hamlet a score, right, ranging, as you can see, from A and B, meaning under government control, things are pretty good, a lot of low activity, right, government's doing good stuff, they're there, right, not so many communists around, all the way down to V-rated hamlets, which were under communist control, right? This particular picture, as you can see, this was taken right after the Tet Offensive. And if you look, there's a heck of a lot of red, all right, or hamlets that are directly under communist control as well, too. But this should give you an indication, like I said, of this kind of intermingling of enemy and friendly forces in a war without fronts. This is what it looks like. This is what allows them to stretch out that war, protract it, avoid annihilation, right? And then ultimately exhaust the Americans as well, too. And then also defeat the South Vietnamese government militarily. All right, here's another kind of similar map, right, as you can see. But again, they changed from those kind of individual hamlets to areas, right? But as you can see, same thing. This is a war without fronts, intermingling. A lot of these areas up here, I know it's probably hard to see, are kind of areas that are either under direct communist control or influence. Yes, they're sparsely populated. They're kind of mountainous areas, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that you have military forces operating inside of South Vietnam, which is supposed to be, quote, technically sovereign, right? It's kind of a sovereign area, right? And this is something that allowed them to constantly harass the Americans, constantly harass the South Vietnamese government and what they were trying to do as well. So this is a little indication of kind of Mao's space, time, and will as well. Again, kind of key points on this, and I'm not sure what my time is. Okay, I have a few more minutes. Yeah, I'll run through this pretty much as quickly as I can. Some of the key kind of moments, right, the kind of important steps, if you will, on the road to communist victory. The first one is the Franco-Vietnamese War. As I said, they combine these three actions: military action, political action, and of course diplomatic action. They protract the war. This really was more of a classic Maoist guerrilla war, but nonetheless, right, they do in fact break France's will by combining these different things, and then they eventually succeed, right? As we know, France leaves after Geneva in 1954, and then you have the existence of two Vietnams, right, which is this, right? There were supposed to be elections held in 1956, a referendum to reunite the country. That never happens due to this guy down below, right? No Diem, right, who becomes First, he's prime minister, appointed by Bao Dai, the last Vietnamese emperor down there. He reneges on that. He holds an election, which he wins something like 90% of the vote. 1955, he declares himself president of the Republic of Vietnam, and this is what sets up the Second Indochina War as well, too. Resolution 15, right? This is now something, again, you had that split in the Politburo, right, between between Ho and Giap, right, who wanted to do, first of all, they wanted to do a North First policy. They want to rebuild North Vietnam. We'll worry about liberating the South later on down the road. The hardliners, right, Le Duan, Le Duc Tho, Nguyen Chi Thanh, and others, they're like, no, we want to liberate the South as quickly as possible. There's a power struggle, right, and eventually by 1959, Le Duan is starting to become ascendant in the Politburo, right, and now they call for armed liberation of the South, right, that we're not going to wait around anymore, we're actually going to liberate the South, right. This is one of the things that gets the ball rolling because you have the formation of the National Liberation Front in 1960, so you have an active insurgency in the South. Yes, it is, elements of it are homegrown, but it is directed by Hanoi, right? The idea that they were an independent unit is simply not true, and a lot of this new research has shown that to be true. Yes, you had a lot of indigenous people, there were a lot of non-communists in the National Liberation Front, but at the end of the day, they were directed and received their marching orders and were largely controlled from Hanoi, right? Here is Le Duan's kind of important modification to Mao's warfare, and that's the general offensive and general uprising. And this essentially was an effort to pair military operations in the hinterland of the countryside with popular uprisings in the cities, right? And what would happen, they was hoping that through the combination of the two, right, they would inflict heavy damages on the South Vietnamese army. The people in the cities would simply just rise up, right? They'd be caught up with emotion, right, opposing the South Vietnamese, the corrupt South Vietnamese regime, which had it did have a lot of corruption, a lot of issues. And through this kind of synergy of the popular uprisings in the city and the military actions against the South Vietnamese armed forces, right, you would have a general offensive uprising which would quickly and rapidly topple the South Vietnamese government. They tried this a number of times. The first time is in December of 1963, right? By this point, Le Duan is firmly in control of the Politburo. Ho Chi Minh and the moderates are kind of shoved out of the way. Right, they're discredited in very many ways. They're marginalized, right? Le Duan and the Hawks are now in position. They're in the driver's seat. Resolution 9, now we're looking for the immediate drastic escalation, right? Liberation of the South rapidly. They do this, and they want to make sure that they destroy something called the Strategic Hamlet Program, which is kind of like counterinsurgency, which was making some progress. They want to annihilate South Vietnamese forces before, once again, to preclude the United States. Let's topple Saigon before the Americans can even get involved. They tried again in 1968, right? After 1963, we know the United States does get involved. The South Vietnamese regime is on the ropes in 64. This is what prompts American intervention and the insertion of U.S. combat forces in 65. Increasing a number of troops over time, right? So that by 1969, there's over 500,000 American combat forces. Despite that, the war is essentially stalemated, right? It doesn't matter. We simply cannot eliminate the communist threat. They cannot topple the South Vietnamese regime due to the American presence. So they go for another broke again, the 1968 Tet Offensive. It's a nationwide attack, right, largely by the National Liberation Front in the South, right? What they were trying to do is pin down Americans, right? Again, generate a popular uprising in the cities and hoping to rapidly overthrow the government. It simply doesn't happen, right? There's political fallout after the Tet Offensive fails. It's a tactical defeat, right, for Hanoi and the National Liberation Front. However, it's a strategic victory for a number of different things, right? America caps its commitment, right? It now moves to American withdrawal and Vietnamization, meaning trying to turn the war back over to the South Vietnamese armed forces, right? Opens up the Paris peace talks. William Westmoreland is kicked upstairs to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? And of course, most famously, LBJ refuses to run for re-election. This opens the door for the Paris peace talks, the Nixon presidency, again, no time to go in here, right? Afterwards, they go down to protracted warfare, right? This effort to kind of go for broke fails again for the second time. Le Duan is chastened. He's still firmly in control of the Politburo, but they go back to this kind of protracted war strategy, again, using economy of force tactics, so on and so forth. This is about 2 years. Meanwhile, the Americans are leaving this whole period, right? So they try to revive it again, go for broke in 1972. By this point, the Americans are almost gone, right? They feel this is another opportunity to once again achieve some kind of rapid knockout blow against the South Vietnamese regime. This is highly conventional. As you can see, this is no longer this kind of more hybrid fight. Yes, you still have some elements of guerrilla warfare in the South, but this is largely a conventional fight. They make some gains, however, they're beaten back largely to the point of departure, right? As you can see here, highly conventional again, right? However, this important aspect is that they establish a toehold inside of South Vietnam, particularly in the northern and the kind of the northern provinces, right? Particularly Quang Tri province, which we're in total control of, and in the western provinces. One thing why this is important and significant, because it's as part of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, the North Vietnamese are allowed to leave their forces. I think well over 100,000 North Vietnamese Army regulars inside of South Vietnam, and that's going to turn later into a Trojan horse, if you will. Right? After the Paris peace talks, it's really, they're getting what they wanted all along, which was the special war. Them and the South Vietnamese regime alone, right? Doesn't go too far, right, for long, right? However, as I said, as a result of the 1972 Easter Offensive, they have a large presence inside of South Vietnam, and they're brought up to those important critical kind of populated areas as well. However, in 1973 and 1974, as we know, Watergate starts heating up, right? The Nixon administration now, and it's pretty obvious to the communists that after the passage of the War Powers Act, right, and that Congress votes that we are no longer going to use military activity in South Vietnam, that they're going to try one more time to do this, right? So they do this again in 1975, and this works. It's a highly conventional fight. There's some strategic mistakes that are made by the South Vietnamese government, right? But again, this is a highly conventional fight. They go for broke one more time, and it works through this kind of combination. So this coup de main, right, as I said, which is what this was in the 1972 Easter Offensive, it's really effective by this point because when they launch this, the South Vietnamese regime is strung out. They're tired. They're an economic basket case due to the restriction of American aid now as well, too. Right, so having this very patient form of warfare, they are able to achieve their objectives. Now, again, I know I'm close on time, so this is my kind of so what on this. What's the relevance? Why is this still important, right? And I think recent events play this out, right? Simply for the fact of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States does not have a good track record since the end of World War II. And I think that's really the history that the United States likes to tell itself, right? And the lessons that has been learned, right? And some of the quotes up here I think will give an indicator, right? That it seems like America's adversaries are reading the right individuals, including Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh and others, and practicing this very patient kind of warfare, right? Using space, time, and will to break the United States' kind of political commitment to these conflicts, and I think we've seen that in recent days, right? So for me, that's the kind of relevance of this as well, too. So on that note, I think I'm going to have to end here. I know I went over. I usually do, as Kim will tell you. I probably do that in class almost every day as well, too. So thank you for my long-windedness, and thank you for attending as well, too. Thank you. Yes, sir, please.
I believe Ho Chi Minh wrote letters to Harry Truman, but Truman never saw those letters. Did Eisenhower or Kennedy or Nixon ever see those letters, or did anybody ever read them?
That's a very good question, sir, but unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, so.
Hi, sir.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
It's my second lecture from you today, so lucky me. Right. Both enjoyable.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned that the United States and South Vietnam had really no aspirations to move into North Vietnam, and so pardon my ignorance up front. So why is that? If we knew that that's where they were reinforcing themselves, why wouldn't we go to Vietnam? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, that's a great question, and that's one of the things that often frustrated a lot of people at the time, and I think maybe some people since, right? Because there's the narrative that we could have won this had we done things differently and maybe gone into strategic offense. But really the bottom line is the ghosts of Korea were floating around Vietnam, and the idea that if you get too close to the Chinese border, that once again you're going to have intervention, and then it might grow from a regional war into possibly another global war as well, too. So that was really what the main concern was, right? I mean, also LBJ he did not want to rock the boat. His baby, if you will, right, his policy baby was the Great Society, right, his domestic programs. And he did not want to endanger that, right, by calling up the reserves, right, or announcing to the American people, we're really at war, right? That's why he goes to war in a very kind of surreptitious, underhanded way, right, to try to hide and not rock the boat too much and endanger his policy or his domestic policy. So really, those are the key kind of takeaways, is that they feared a larger war would break out, possibly with China or the Soviet Union, right? But then the other thing is LBJ really wanted to fight this war kind of on the periphery, right, to focus on or keep the American public's attention on his domestic policies too. So, thank you.
You describe several theoretical influences on the North Vietnamese leaders, Maoist and Marxist, and their theory that grows out of their own experiences. My question is, if you had to identify something that they came up with that was new and effective and of permanent importance, of lasting importance, what would that be, or do they really not come up with anything that's categorically new?
Great. No, thank you so much for that. And yeah, this mostly comes from the work of Lian Huang Nguyen and Pierre Azoulin. And that's really this diplomatic struggle. This is the thing they really use to their advantage, right? I mean, there's a lot of skill, like you said, going on there with the way they are able to frustrate the French and then the Americans and the South Vietnamese government, the way they're able to sell their brand and portray the war in black and white terms internationally. But really, I think the key that they've identified, right, is the idea that this target of undermining the will of your adversary, particularly their domestic populations, by sending that message, we're not fighting you, right? We're with you. We like you, but it's your unjust government who's fighting this criminal war, taking these criminal actions against us. And I think that's really what undermines America's political will, ultimately in the end. So I really think that's the thing that they've identified that is the kind of thing that's a little different than what was seen before.
Kind of a cultural question about students at Fort Leavenworth as not a member of the military, but with quite a lot of knowledge of military history, and I've traveled and done military history tours in Europe and quite a lot of experience. In the 80s, largely people turned away from wanting to think about the Vietnam War because it just was not a good time and positive to think about. So let's just fight tanks at the Fulda Gap and focus on that. But now, with obviously experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, do students really want to engage with the Vietnam War and really think about things rather than just sort of put it in a box about stuff we don't want to think about?
Right, no, thank you. I mean, that's a great question, but I'd say that the reluctance to really look at Vietnam, it was not just the 80s, it was the 90s, it was the 2000s, and it's up through today. Yeah, I'm a little shocked, if you will, the kind of concern about Vietnam, right? That you would think, particularly in recent, times too, that it's simply not there, right? I mean, and I don't think it's just at Leavenworth. I just think there's just something about, the idea that we like comfortable narratives and we don't like, uncomfortable things, and this looks simple and doable and knowable, I'm going to go with this as opposed to here. And that's kind of when, and Kim can testify to this, is like my opening spiel for when this year was the whole idea of like, we are not learning, right, key lessons and looking at the right people, that one of the last slides I showed. And I'm wondering, and I read the Afghanistan papers, I'm like, I know these individuals went through CGSC, and I know they were taught Vietnam because the very large shoes that I was brought in to replace, he's been teaching it for 30 years, right? He's shouting it from the mountaintop. So I know they got this message, but why, the focus can still on Fulda Gap, or now it's First Gulf War, I don't know.
Well, it seems that in the Vietnam War, the practice of deception by the senior commanders in the United States forces was used to delude both the civilian government and the civilian populace about the success of the war. And then the same thing was done in the war in Afghanistan.
Yes.
So will the military ever learn about not using deception against their own people?
I mean, I hope so. And this is one of the things that I was shocked, right, when I read the Afghanistan papers. I saw so many things that I've seen through reading about Vietnam, right? The kind of the inflation or outright fabrication of progress, right? The reluctance of commanders, right, not to, you know, to claim that they left the place better than when they found it. Right, and I guess, I mean, on one hand, I understand that kind of impulse, but, I mean, on the other hand, I mean, yeah, there's plenty of deception to go around. There's a lot of parallels between that. The way the war is sold, the lack of candor about what's really going on, the myths and things that were created about this real situation on the ground, or ability or attempts to try to cover that up. There's still very many strong parallels between that, and I don't know if it will change in the future. I mean, on one hand, and this is what I try to tell my students. I'm like, I understand it's easier to say, well, somebody should retire or just, you know, speak out. I mean, when you build, it takes you so long to build a career, you know, just to fall on your sword. Right? I understand it's tough, but still, I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's got to be some truth speak when things are not going well for the United States overseas.
I would add to that. I've been teaching at CBSC as long as Sean has, not as long as Jeff has, but it's not deliberate deception, sir. It's a brand of self-delusion, hype, or somebody calls it principle ignorance, this sort of deliberate ignorance. You know that there's something wrong, but you're just going to kind of ignore the elephant in the room. But as far as being deliberate deception, I wouldn't call it that. I mean, we had a book up there that was published in 2016, 2017 that basically said we lost, not we're losing, we lost by a 3-star general who did not take 4 stars because he was honest. And what impact did it have on the American people? 0. Okay, so they're not all being deceptive. They're not all being self-delusional. It's just, I think we just don't like bad news in the United States. The Chiefs are going to win this
It seems the United States always ends up backing the losing or corrupt side. Going back to the Second World War, I think Franklin Roosevelt wanted to dispatch Chiang Kai-shek, but no one would do that. And then when we get into Vietnam, I mean, Diem, and he was assassinated, and then it seems that it just goes bad from there. The leaders, pardon me for kind of lecturing here, but the leaders of South Vietnam were predominantly Catholic, while the people were predominantly Buddhist, and that was not going to work.
Right. I mean, you still have that that tension and that friction. And when I teach my Vietnam elective, I try to tell my students, you can't underestimate, right, the long memory of colonialism and how it casts a long shadow, and it taints almost every relationship. And Catholicism definitely dealt with that. Now, Diem was definitely a Catholic, but I believe that during the second regime, New Van Thieu and Cao Van Ky were not Catholics, right? So there was a large Catholic contingency, but it did not dominate the government after Diem. Diem was definitely, he was a Catholic and very, there was issues related to that, particularly with the Buddhist crisis and other things, but regardless, it's an element there which created friction in the society and created some kind of, because it's, it was one thing among many of which, South Vietnam was just such a fractured society. Down in the Mekong Delta, you had 3 different, independent political movements / militias, right? Each with their own agenda. One was a criminal mafioso type group. You had communists who didn't go north of the 17th parallel in 1954, also agitating. But then, so there's all these different elements in political kind of conflict going on, but the Catholic element was definitely an important part, particularly with undermining Diem and or poisoning his relationship with the general population. They just did not see eye to eye.
Sorry if I'm prolonging, delaying anyone's dinner. This might be more of an opinion question, sir, but when I think about Giep, I have my own opinions about him as a military strategist and, where he racks and stacks against maybe more of the more well-studied generals of the 20th century. So as compared to maybe Montgomery or Zukov or Eisenhower or Patton, what are your thoughts on Giep as just a military mind or a military strategist?
Well, thank you for that. Douglas Pike and others have said that really Giep was not some great strategist. What his genius was logistics, and that's where you particularly saw it at Dien Bien Phu, right? The ability to get heavy artillery up on the mountaintop and then turn it into a siege, right? Because he did make mistakes, right? He had this protracted idea. In 1951, he tries to go too fast. He tries to initiate that third mobile warfare counteroffensive aspect, and he gets beat up pretty good, but then he goes back. So I don't think it was, as a strategist, I don't think he was that good, but I think he was smart and he was pragmatic about it too. And after 1964, he doesn't get completely erased, but he's pretty much marginalized. They bring him back in some role and stuff, but he doesn't have too much. So, but logistically, and this is from from what I've read, that was his real key contribution, was not only in the case of Dien Bien Phu, but the ability to funnel manpower and material down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to keep that insurgency going year after year. That was really something that he excelled at.
Earliest slide said there is no counter strategy.
Right.
Is that where we are today? We still have no counter. Where are they going to go? Ho Chi Minh's not going to go to Antarctica.
No.
So where are the Taliban going to go? This is their country. Does that mean we have no ability to enforce or to prevail anywhere in this situation?
Yeah, no. That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, right? There's Western conceptions of warfare and trying to, conduct wars within the parameters of kind of international law and these other things, it's a little different, right? I mean, it's not that, you know, they get to win because they cheat, you know, it's not that, but it's just, I think it's just a fundamental difference in how you view what you're doing and how you get to where you want to get, right? And what you're willing to do that. I don't know, and that's why I wonder. And I mean, I don't know how to answer the question, but I've wrestled with that, you know, that question myself. Like, how can you solve this issue? What do you do? Right? Because I mean, there's different theories, right? I mean, you can either just crush them militarily, but that can often generate pushback. The idea is that you can just nation build in some places where you can't nation build is simply another, you know, shown to be unsuccessful. You know, the idea that if you eradicate certain situations, if you create certain contexts, you won't have guerrilla movements and insurgencies to begin with, right? Because it's a question of the haves and have-nots, right? So I think there's just so many different facets to this type of warfare, but I think they're all contingent on certain situations and circumstances. But how we deal with these issues, and if we can deal with them in a way that's acceptable to, right, in a democratic society, like what we deem as a people, right, who the military is doing for the nation, acceptable or not, I don't know if we're ever willing to go that far to allow levels of extremes to kind of wipe these things. And I don't know how else you would kind of get at them, so.
If you don't mind, let me take a quick shot at that. We have won some. Greece in 47, 48. We won. Dominican Republic. We took down a government, put a government into Panama that works. You haven't heard about Grenada unless you're missing your nutmeg. The Cambodia sort of works. That was a UN peacekeeping mission. Look at the UN peacekeeping missions where the United Nations is able to go into the Bosnias, and it works. Now, Somalia, not so much, but there's actually a part of Somalia that works today very well and should be its own country. So I think part of the issue is to look at each of the situations individually and then take a look at the Afghanistans or the Iraqs or some of the places that have not worked out so well and say, this might not have been a good place to go. But sometimes you don't know until you're there and you actually know the internal workings. But the idea that Western powers, the United States, has never been in on a successful counterinsurgency, I think is a bad place to start. And so it does not naturally follow.
You know, we could win, which doesn't really tell you anything useful. I mean that, you know, you can win the little easily winnable ones, but how does that help you deal with the ones that are challenging?
Yeah, no, I mean, And I think that's like a key difference. And this is like when it comes to, you know, like strategy and military concepts, I know that oftentimes semantics and definitions are hard to pin down, and what does it mean by guerrilla warfare or an insurgency or a partisan war or anything like that. But I think that's where possibly there's a difference, right? Because I don't think this was not a key counterinsurgency, and that's why one of the reasons why the United States loses it, because it's not just a matter of those tangibles, the inputs you can do. Because, you know, we were trying to do the nation building thing, right? Hey, we'll build schools and medical dispensaries, and we'll build the economy and give you things and give you, you know, hybrid rice varieties to grow your economy. And there were certain things that were there, but this was much more complex than that. And I think that's possibly another reason why the United States has been so unsuccessful with these kinds of things, is because we cast it as an insurgency and a counterinsurgency, and I think it's much more complex and bigger than that, and you have all these other issues and these kind of moving parts with it as well too. So I think it's, yeah, maybe some classic kind of where it is just a counterinsurgency, we can easily isolate it, kill it, is successful, but when it's like this, when it's a regional war, it's a civil war, it's a ideological Cold War, right? It's a global struggle, right? And all these different actors and these things going, and I think that's what makes it harder, right, to kind of deal with and kind of have a counter strategy to that, right? Especially if you have a movement that's just so successful, right? I mean, like groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and ISIS I think is more similar to what we saw with the Vietnamese communists, because the communists simply weren't, the idea of a guerrilla movement that you could be just a movement and you don't need a kind of a state to call your own, right? Because part of the insurgencies in the 1960s is that they were trying to build their own states, or actually an anti-state within the larger body, which would eventually metastasize, grow larger, and overcome the whole. So they needed that real world thing, right? Not just an idea of revolution floating around. You needed real tangible benefits, something you point to, say, here's our spot on the world, here's what we're doing for these kind of people. And this is where there's a similarity with ISIS. But ISIS had no ability to kind of, you know, gain, you know, with the exception of like-minded jihadis, right, to gain movement or sympathy among people for their plight. There's just no way of doing it. They're so brutal, right? We're here, right, they were able to really, you know, bring up true, right, aspects of the American war effort that were questionable, or the French war effort that were questionable, right? To cast it in those terms, we're fighting for kind of national liberation. They were, right? And as I said, they were brutal to do it, but they were able to gain sympathies because there was some element of legitimacy in their aims, where terrorists and other kind of modern insurgencies that we see nowadays, it's simply not that case, the case with that as well too. So, but I don't know, I'm just probably just babbling at this point. So.
You described the so-called extremist wing of the North Vietnamese Communist Party, led Xuan and Ly Duc Tho, etc. And you show them sending conventional forces south again and again in 63 and 68, and 72, 74, 75, and again they get completely clobbered, just hammered to a pulp. Now, my question is, until the Americans leave, when the Americans leave, they can finally have some success. But my question is, do you think that they are good strategists?
I think so, just simply for the case of what I said. The idea that for them, the center of gravity was the political will of France and the United States, and they achieved that objective. They had to do it, you know, and that old kind of macabre adage, you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. But they were, and this is where I say they were ruthless and committed, is that the fact that they were willing to do this year after year, and they were willing to send, right, tens and tens of thousands of young men to their deaths, right, to achieve this end, and they were not going to give it up. And even when they were negotiating, they were not negotiating to have some kind of negotiated settlement. They were negotiating to buy time because they never lost sight of what they were going to do and how they wanted to do it. So I would say crude strategists, but strategists nonetheless.
How did the North Vietnamese feed their forces? Did they have just an unbelievable agriculture, or we weren't able to interdict their food supply?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Communist forces, they had two ways of doing it. They either lived off the local economy in the South, which is what they did, particularly the National Liberation Front. In areas under their control, they grew rice, or they were able easily to get it from the population, either by buying it, confiscating it, or contributions from areas that were very sympathetic to the insurgency. As far as the South goes, as the war went on, agricultural output in both North and South suffered heavily, and they relied on imports, right? For the South Vietnamese, it was the United States, but for the North Vietnamese, it was either China or the Soviets, who were giving them the things they needed, including kind of grain and things to feed their soldiers as well, too. So it was a kind of a hybrid thing. They were living off the South Vietnamese economy as much as possible, but they were also getting part of the aid was food as well too, and rations for the soldiers. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Great questions. Thank you all. Appreciate it.